Good afternoon. In the Scottish political world, there was a figure that seemed for a while immovable. She was called Nicola Sturgeon. She's no longer in post. She's sitting in the back benches and her political career is over. Now, the reason for this may be to do with finances within the SNP. We haven't yet got any direct evidence of that. What we do have direct evidence of, and we saw it on our screens and it was spectacular, is the collapse of Nicola Sturgeon and her entire political narrative over the issue of gender, over the issue of what is a woman. And this was a question that she found herself unable to answer. We had the ridiculous sight of government ministers saying, in order to determine whether a male rapist was in fact a woman, they would need either more information or expert advice or more education themselves, because we can no longer know what a woman is. Now, the fall of Nicola Sturgeon and her inability to deal with this question was brought about more than any other single group, by a grassroots group within Scotland called For Women Scotland, who campaigned on this issue. And their success has been tremendous. Their courage has been considerable. And we're able to talk directly to one of their organisers today, Susan Smith. Susan, welcome to UK Column.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So if we can go back to the start of the story, when did you decide that becoming an activist and coping with all that comes with that, police attention, amongst other things, when did you decide that was necessary, and what was the kind of defining point that made you stand up and get involved?
I think I'm a bit of an accidental activist, and I think that's quite a common theme if you speak to a lot of women on this. It was something that was being talked about in various groups online, on Facebook groups, or on Mumsnet, which has been known as the radicalisation portal for a lot of women. And it was little things. It had started out being little things at school or things at work. And so women got together, as women often do, and started talking about things and saying, well, this can't be quite right. And why are we, while we're happy for people to live as they want to live, and we have great sympathy for people who feel that their bodies are not right for whatever reason, there's an issue here, there's a clash. And I think it was just a desire to have a conversation that a lot of women then went back to either their employers or their political parties and said, can we have a conversation about this? And everyone was met with a wall of stony silence. So the really galvanizing thing for a lot of us was when the consultation started to happen. And the consultation started to happen in Scotland a bit earlier than the one in the rest of the UK. And there was an initial one that passed almost without notice. And it was after that one closed that a group of women in Scotland decided to come together and form the organisation that we now have as For Women Scotland, because we felt that there was still room to fight this and we needed to keep on fighting it.
The issue of the mainstream parties not having any dialogue is one I've come on before. They expect their supporters, their activists, to fall into line with whatever the policy happens to be. But there doesn't actually seem to be, certainly not in Scotland, and as far as I can tell, it's pretty thin on the ground elsewhere too, any forum where if you think one of the political parties is going astray, that you can actually have a dialogue about this. Doesn't seem to be possible. It's all about compliance. Now, one of the reasons that I was momentarily distracted there was the comment you made about Mumsnet being a radicalisation portal. Now, I thought, I've got to check that, because that's got the sound of something that actually has been said before. And sure enough, a journalist called Katie Baker published an article called Mumsnet and the Fostering of Anti-Trans Radicalisation. That was the subtitle. The main title was The Road to Turfdom. Right, a skit on F.A. Harrick's great work, The Road to Serfdom. And that was obviously a major publication and work in the freedom-loving, small government endorsing right wing of the 40s, 50s, 60s, etc. So this was an anti-state, quite a radical agenda in A Road to Serfdom, a warning by Hayek about what big government could bring. So it's interesting that they drew that parallel, but also just fascinating that Mumsnet has been characterised in this way. And this gets to the core of what, if you want to call it kind of normal female opinion, the viewpoint of normal women in our society has been painted as radical, as toxic, as problematic, that your belief system, the belief system that most women had for most of history, is suddenly no longer acceptable. So just before we go into the detail of this, could you say a little more about what it was like to try and be heard, actually try and have a conversation about any of these issues with the mainstream, either the press or the political machine?
It was really odd, because what it seemed as though was that all the things that people had believed in 10, 15, 20 years ago suddenly were beyond the pale. And I am not somebody who ever had extreme views on sex and gender. As I say, I was always pretty relaxed about it until we got to the point where people were saying that a simple declaration of a change of gender was enough for somebody to come into a women's changing room or a rape crisis centre. And I thought, well, that can't be right. And that's not what we were talking about 10 years ago. So I think a lot of us just wanted to go back and check. So we just went back to the political party or the employer or somebody and said, hang on a second, I know you want to provide for this person, but can you have a care for some of the women who might not be comfortable with this? And at that point, you realise that you were now the worst of the worst. You were a bigot, and there was nowhere you could go. You couldn't actually have this conversation with people. They just said you needed to educate yourself, that you were judging people who were vulnerable. And all these things, these really surprising things from people who often themselves were probably people who would have been far more reactionary. Well, I think they are still more reactionary than I am. They've just swung the other way. So some of them would have been people who back in the day would have had no toleration for gender nonconformity or no toleration for different sexualities. And now they've completely swung the other way. And now they have no toleration for anybody who doesn't agree with that. So it's an object lesson as well in how effective policy capture can be, and how effective a very small group of people can be in going in somewhere and getting a message accepted and changing public policy without ever changing public opinion, which is also fascinating, that they managed to change public policy and then turn around to the public and say, well, your opinion is now wrong and wicked. And people were too scared for a long time to push back on that. And it's only because the women's organisations have had this success that now people are able to say, well, this is nonsense. Obviously, nobody believes this. But a few years ago, I think people were still very scared to say what they actually did believe, because the pendulum had swung without anybody actually realising what was going on.
Yes, this is the problem of the long march through the institutions. The institutions are captured, and it happens in secret. The public's not made aware of this until everything's in place and the activists are ready to push their agenda and coercive room, because it's not about, at this point, it's not about persuading, it's about power, it's about bullying, it's about forcing people to be silent and to do things and say things that they know is wrong. They know in their heart is without foundation or is a lie, which is a very strange thing to behold. When pushing back against this, which I personally started to do probably, maybe about 2010, 2011, something like this. You start going on Twitter and you start discovering what pressures are being applied to silence you. And this requires a bit of thought about what's going on here. What are we up against? I've been called all these words. Are they valid? People are saying bigot and all the rest of it. Where's that coming from? And a bit of research and a bit of thought reveals where it's coming from and how to fight it. But it's very difficult when you first come across it, because people aren't looking for this. They're just going in there, they're having a normal exchange, and they're putting forward views they think are entirely mainstream, and all of a sudden they're getting this response. I find it particularly sad when you look at people who are maybe formerly of the radical left, and who don't buy the idea that men can go into women's changing rooms because they choose to, and don't buy into all of this. People like Caroline Stock, who was very much a person of the left, and was attacked horrendously and mercilessly over her stance. I think it's harder for these people who are not used to being attacked from that direction. And for people who are coming from a very much a moderate middle of the road position, who are not used to being attacked as radicals and dangerous extremists, so to actually handle that sort of pressure, it must have been very strange. I mean, how did you cope with this on a personal basis? The mudslinging, the name calling that comes with standing up against this ideology.
Yeah, it was weird, and it was very hard, because, as you say, it tended to be people who previously had been your fellow travellers. I said that I was never used to being on what might have been called the wrong side of an argument, from the perspective of people who maybe considered themselves more progressive and more socially aware. And so you do then have this enormous pressure, because when you're being told by people who are on your side, in theory, that your views are wrong and wicked, you want an explanation for that. And I think for me, it was the fact that I wasn't getting the explanation. And I have always believed that in debate, I was... when I was younger, I had a very argumentative grandfather who was nominally a communist, but would argue anything and liked to argue for the sake of it. So I learned how to make a case and have an argument. And then he was incredible. He'd go away and take your arguments and use them on somebody else. So it was, to me, there was an intellectual element to that process. But that was how you arrive at a conclusion. You moderate your views, you have the conversation, you have the argument, and then you say, okay, that's tested part of my belief structure. So now I need to think about how I can refocus and what else I need to take on board. And this wasn't happening. And so any question you came up with, I had been involved in a ridiculous conversation with a group, a political group, and there was a woman who was a rugby coach, and she had said it is dangerous to put male people in with women on a rugby team, which, is not controversial, it's common sense. And the pushback from some of these, and it was especially men, but there was also a group of young women as well, who just said, but you can't say that. You mustn't say that. You're not allowed to say that. And then you start to say, well, why? On what basis are you making this argument? What's your scientific evidence? And in the end, it did, as you said, just end up being name calling. And at that point, I suppose I tend to try and avoid conflict, but I do have a little bit of an awkward bugger streak in me. That meant when I was younger, I would go and find people in the playground to stick up for if I felt that people were being thoroughly unreasonable. So I do have some of that awkward spirit in me. And I thought, actually, no, if all these people have is name calling, that's not good enough. And I think that when I'd started to have these conversations and with other feminists and looking at groups, and people were talking about starting up groups, and I thought, well, somebody's going to do this. Somebody better qualified, somebody more in touch, somebody who's got a bit more of a track record on campaigning. One of these people are going to take it on. Somebody's going to do this. And when nobody steps up, I think you get to the point, if you know that something's right, or certainly this is how I feel. If I know that something's right, I feel that I have to step up. If nobody else is going to do it, I might not be the best person to do it, but somebody's got to do it.
This brings us to, the campaign and how you went about this. Now, firstly, you did have a slogan as a hashtag, which I thought was wonderful. Right? It was Women Won't Wheesht. For those of you outside of Scotland, wheesht is a Scots term meaning be silent. And of course, your silent acquiescence was what was being demanded, not too gently either. And I thought this was a wonderful hashtag, a wonderful summary of your position, because it did rather suggest that some of the negative views of women from the past, right, that women might not have had their opinions valued as they should have had, weren't given the prominence and weren't listened to the degree that they should have been. Right? Now that may or may not be true of the past, but it's certainly the perception of the past. We're in fact coming back again, and it was taking this item of this tag of silencing women, of bullying women, of coercing silence from an unwilling human being, and putting it on this group who were presenting themselves as the ultimate in caring, the ultimate in virtuous, the ultimate in far-sighted and liberal, and saying, no, you're not liberal. You're as you said, reactionary. You're trying to take us backwards. You're trying to ignore us once again, and we're not for this. I thought it was a wonderful hashtag. Really got to the heart of the matter in 3 words. Could you take us through sort of the early part of the campaign? What did you do, and what was the reaction?
Well, so that hashtag actually, and I think this is a lovely example of how organic this has been. That was a lady who's anonymous on Twitter. She has very deeply personal reasons for resisting this, to do with a family member. And she came up with it, and it tied rather beautifully into another campaign that had started at that time, which was a lot of women were going around leaving messages on slates, chalked messages, tying ribbons, putting these slates on, just a line, a quote, and coloured ribbons. And it was a very gentle campaign. And it provoked the most extreme reactions in a lot of people who were hugely indignant that women were tying ribbons and using arts and crafts to make a political point. And so that'll dovetail very nicely with the Women Won't Wheesht campaign. And of course, it has that beautiful alliteration, and it did go completely global, I think. And so it became something of a rallying call. and because of the timing as well, because it was coming in when all these debates in Scotland were getting very, very heated, we were taking the Scottish government to court over the public boards. And as you say, it feeds back into this narrative of keeping women in their place. And one of the more depressing things over this period has been how many people still hold on to prejudices that I thought were things of the past, and how many of those people would consider themselves the good guys. People who are very, very swift to demonize especially older women, and will openly say things like, "Oh, you're an old bigot. So why?" And some of the most horribly misogynistic language about older women that I've seen. And of course, the comeback to those people is that one day they're going to be old, and we hope that they won't encounter the kind of horrific prejudice that sadly still seems to exist. But I think it was beautifully. It was just a perfect phrase. It was a beautifully expressed phrase, a perfect phrase, and we took it. Obviously, it became a big rallying cry at all of our demos. We had several demos outside Parliament, lots of chanting of it. We had the last probably really big one would have been just before they had the final debate on the GRR bill, but there'd been several before that. And it's been wonderful because it's been such an affirmative message, and so many women have found their voice. And I think so many women who ordinarily would not be wanting to speak up have found their voice and have been taking on campaigning and going to different parts of the country and speaking up and organising meetings. So it's a really positive message.
I remember seeing a documentary once about Holloway Prison, women's prison, and it had many organisational problems and there was behavioural problems, and a lot of this is stemmed from its reconstruction. And they were interviewing a very experienced Scottish woman prison officer who was explaining what was going wrong. And she said, she was talking about the isolation that the building physically caused to the women. And she said it's totally different running a women's prison than running a male prison. Because if a male prisoner kicks off, you put him in solitary and he calms down. If a woman prisoner kicks off, you put her in with another woman prisoner and they talk and they calm down. If you put her in solitary, she gets worse. She goes, women are not the same as men. And I think one of the other things that was beautiful about the Women Won't Wheesht is all human beings have a realisation that the way women communicate and the way men communicate is different. And women will talk to one another and find a great deal of benefit from doing so. And to force them to be silent is to force them to do something that is against their nature. And there's something unnatural about saying the opposite, the women must wheesht. And I think it also pointed at the unnatural nature of the legislation that was being foisted on our country. A little bit of that came out from the slogan as well. So yes, beautifully judged. Now, when you started, I was at that the last demonstration outside Parliament you describe, and this was I think a wonderful moment because you had all of these different groups. You had groups that were campaigning against the sexualisation of children and the education issues. You had some smaller political groups like the Scottish Family Party. You had the Women for Scotland and all of the campaigners against the GRR bill, Gender Recognition Reform bill. And all of these people who were very different and had very different worldviews. You had Christians, you had feminists, you had all sorts of different people with different views of the world, and they all came together and they kind of united that day. And they said, look, we're here to protect the women and the children of this country from what is happening inside the Parliament. And I thought the clarity that came out of that was really striking. And a moment where I felt, no, something is shifting here. You could feel the change happening sort of on that day. If you could take us through some of your other experiences of campaigning. I know, for example, recently you've had some difficulty in Aberdeen. I remember one of the other demonstrations, I wasn't at it, but I saw video where a very large man in a frock was charging forward and getting in the face of a very small woman and repeatedly shouting the word witch at her. It was very aggressive. It was full of anger and a kind of uncontrolled rage that did suggest that if the police weren't there, something bad might have happened. Is that type of reaction from the campaigners in favour of gender reform and gender fluidity, essentially, is that something you've had to face a lot?
Yes, and obviously it served a purpose for them for a while, because there were a lot of women who were very scared, especially in the early days, to come to a meeting. The first meetings that happened in Scotland around this were probably, I think they were the beginning of 2018. There was one in Edinburgh and one in Glasgow. And at the Glasgow one, an individual who is pretty notorious these days for his involvement in this movement, interrupted the meeting and was shouting out, had managed to get inside. And then I think at the Edinburgh one, there was a group supported by an organisation that claims to be a feminist organisation, but they had turned up explicitly to make a noise, to try to disrupt. They'd got masks on, they were very frightening looking, big dogs, and they were shouting during a speech that was given by somebody who'd suffered from child sexual abuse. And they were asked if they could stop, because this was somebody, that deserves to be heard, irrespective of views on a particular topic. That is somebody who was speaking at great sort of personal difficulty. It was a difficult thing for her to do, and they did not respect it, which I think was when a lot of people realised that these individuals were not there because they care about people who are vulnerable. They were there because they care about power, and they were exercising power in this situation, the power to tell women, as you've said before, to be silent, to shut up, to not talk about things, to stay in their place. It's got better, but the first meeting we had under the For Women Scotland brand name, because these other meetings had been held by other groups before For Women Scotland was founded, that was in January of 2019. And the hotel that we had the meeting at was absolutely swamped by phone calls, emails, again, organised by a group that claims to be feminist, and by a bookshop in Edinburgh. And they rang this venue and basically threatened them. And so the meeting couldn't go ahead unless we got a lot more security. We had no money at this point. We only just started. We had no money. We had only, I think Marion had put the meeting on her own credit card. And we were either faced with we had to cancel it, or we had to commit to spending hundreds of pounds that we didn't have on extra security. So we took the risk. We got the security. We went ahead with the meeting, which was a great success. And then we put out a message the next day asking for help, and the response was incredible. But it was written up in the papers, so we got publicity out of it, and I think it reinforced the fact that you have to stand your ground and you have to stare them down. But yes, that some of them are frightening and some of them have been violent, and there are individuals who are potentially very frightening. We have had to report a couple of people to the police. One was charged for threatening us. And what is particularly galling is that the organisations that supported this person, because they were due to be performing a Trans Pride, and the organisation supporting Trans Pride that year, the organisations who are supposed to campaign for trans rights, refused to condemn this. They refused to say that this wasn't something that was acceptable. Now, if there were women running around threatening to blow up these organisations, we would have something to say about that. We would have something to say about anyone threatening violence. But unfortunately, organisations funded by the Scottish Government apparently cannot condemn violence. And later on, there was a meeting that was very hard to arrange at Edinburgh University. And actually, it wasn't even particularly on this subject. It touched on it, but it was largely about violence against women and why protections are needed in society. And Julie Bendel, the feminist journalist and campaigner, had come up to speak, and she was talking about prostitution and violence against women. So all of her speech was just about women, women's rights, people being violent to women. And as she exited that meeting, an individual, sort of 6'2", beard, but I believe wearing a skirt, ran up and tried to punch her, and was only prevented because there were 3 security guards there, and managed to pull him off. And when she reported it afterwards, she said that she saw this man try to punch her. And the response from certain sections of the liberal press was, "How dare you call that person a man?" Not "how dare that person try and hit a woman," but "how dare you call that person a man?" So yes, quite. I think it's got. Do you know? It's hugely counterproductive, right? It's a terribly counterproductive thing to do, and the more sensible people will realise it. But it doesn't stop it. We had saw the placards recently, earlier this year, with "decapitate TERFs" on them. Julie Marshall, who is part of an organisation in a sort of local group in Glasgow, they're organising little meetings under the Women Won't Wheesht banner. They're fully autonomous little groups, and she was the person who was attacked in Aberdeen. So they are still doing it, and they feel justified because they are spinning a narrative. Some people are cynically and dangerously spinning a narrative that people want them dead, that people want to hurt them, that they want to eradicate them. And it's all nonsense. But you have to believe this, I suppose, in order to justify being violent towards a group of ordinary women.
This has been building for some time, of course. We saw this back in 2017 under the phrase "punch a Nazi," right? Or the suggestion was, well, it's okay. Violence is okay if it's a Nazi, which of course then begs the question, well, how do you define Nazi? And it was, of course, the person I happened to be punching at the moment. I mean, that really was the only definition. And then this phrase would be used to essentially demonize people and make them subject to violence. So it was a label that was applied to people who didn't have the correct political opinions in order to dehumanize them. Dehumanization is always the first step towards violence, sometimes very extreme violence. one of the other aspects of this is, of course, the idea that silence is violence, right? This is obviously not true, but it was the claim that if you, not only if you oppose the trans rights activists, but if you simply fail to adequately support their viewpoint, that is also violence. So this justifies essentially any amount of violence on their part under the banner of self-defense. Now, this narrative, crazy though it is, you're quite right, we've seen it playing out quite often, including signs with a guillotine illustrated on them, calling for decapitation of what's called TERFs, which stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminist, which is the made-up slur word for feminists who do not buy into trans ideology. Being held up at a rally in Glasgow, attended by many cabinet ministers and MSPs, and all of the great and the so-called good of the Scottish political scene, and this was okay apparently. And for a while, this was getting, it's still getting tolerated, but as essentially the majority of the population have found the courage to push back against the ideology and to point out the harm that it does, and to point out the nasty, aggressive nature of things. And they have done that because of people like yourselves have taken the lead and been first to oppose it. As the ideology has got more resistance coming from the population at large, it's no longer being accepted. It's no longer being acceptable. There was the recent case down in London where a trans rights activist, a very violent man who had a horrendous background of violent conduct and the prison sentence that goes with it, stood up in a frock and called on people to punch a TERF. He was arrested by the Metropolitan Police, but he got let off essentially by the courts because this was somehow, I think his defence was he was simply advertising and trying to get attention. So there's still failure to protect people from this sort of aggressive conduct. But the population is certainly pushing back and is becoming more aware of the risks, and more people are able and willing to speak out. And this has been in no small part because of your campaign. Now, another high point of the campaign was when Kellie J. Keane, Posey Parker, came to Glasgow. Now, I went along to that one as well. There was quite a large counter-demonstration. The usual suspects were all there. And a much larger demonstration by Posey Parker and the mostly female audience, quite a few men there, but mostly female audience, that was along to hear what was being said. And the theme of the meeting was "Let Women Speak." And it was a huge rally. It was in Glasgow Square. It was very enthusiastic. There was a feeling of an idea whose time had come about the whole thing. And I was particularly struck by the speeches, because this was essentially open mic, and various women got up to say, what their viewpoint was or what their story was. And the quality of the speeches, the variety and importance of the ideas that were being discussed was really striking. It was absolutely first class. I was particularly, I particularly remember one girl who had lived for some time as a male and had been convinced that she was born in the wrong body, the whole thing. And she convinced to essentially view her own biology as a mistake, as toxic, as harmful to her. And when she decided that she didn't want to live in this way anymore, she wanted to be who she was, she wanted to be a woman, and she was content with that. She described how all of her friends from the gay and trans community dropped her. She was left completely alone. So here you got someone who's vulnerable. Here you got someone who's taken into community, who are saying, we love you no matter what you are. You be what you want to be. You be your genuine self, and we will love you unconditionally. And the minute she said, yeah, I'm a girl, they were gone, and they left her completely alone. And she was describing very vividly what this was like. That was one of many speeches. I thought the Posey Parker event was excellent. It was another milestone on the way to Nicola Sturgeon no longer being in charge in Scotland. There were signs held up at the time. Posey Parker and Kellie J. Keane had become famous in part for defining a woman as an adult human female and putting on a big billboard. And people objected to this as hate speech. So this was extremely effective advertising. Well, there was a variation on this. People were walking around with T-shirts and signs saying Nicola Sturgeon, noun. And the definition was destroyer of women's rights. So it was hard hitting. It was honest. It was a lot of sincerely felt views put forward. Were you in George Square that day?
No, I wasn't. Sorry, that's a massive failure on my part. But I know my colleagues were, and obviously, that's very much Kelly's thing, and she does it brilliantly. So we do slightly different. We all have. I think we all find our own little niche within this, because there are quite a few women's organisations, and it's great because we try to complement and work alongside. And so I know there were women there, and I think I know who you're referring to doing the speech, and I think it's been a really important exercise that allowing ordinary people to have this voice has been hugely effective, and that's something that the women, as we were talking about the event where Julie was attacked, that's something that those women have taken to doing a sort of open mic event on a more local pared down level, because obviously Kelly's events are now huge and she gets massive crowds because so many people are now aware of that campaign. So there are now little spin-offs. So now it's not just the big events, there are little spin-offs, and people are going and doing them all around the country, which is brilliant. And you're right, the poster was an absolutely inspired piece of marketing, propaganda, campaigning, call it what you want, because had that poster just been left up, nobody would have seen it. Nobody would have noticed. The fact is that people objected to it. And there was another one which we took photos of that, again, was organised by Kelly in Edinburgh, Waverley, for J.K. Rowling's birthday a few years ago. Just a picture of I with a big heart J.K. Rowling, like the I Heart New York, I Heart NYC. And again, there was nothing to object to in that poster. That's just a celebration of a woman who's a writer in Edinburgh, who brought joy to lots of children. But of course, some people could not see that without immediately making a fuss about it. So then it's in the newspapers. So it's an incredibly, actually, the cancel culture in some ways often ends up Streisanding the thing they're trying to cancel. That it's sometimes an incredibly effective way of getting that message out. And so, yeah, I was sorry that I missed the George Square event, because it does sound marvellous. And I think, as you picked up, the people who are being hurt by this and who often do not have a voice are the detransitioners. And so events like that give them a voice. But it's really tough because they shouldn't have to be rehearsing over and over again some of these really devastating stories. And they are devastating. And And you're right, the way that they are loved bombed, they're brought in, you do this, we'll all love you, you're your authentic self, and then they're dropped. It's very much like a cult. It has all the hallmarks of being, you're good as long as you go along with the cult, but if the moment you step out of line, your friends won't speak to you ever again. So it's awful, and it is young and vulnerable people who are being suckered into this because they are being given a reason for feeling maybe that they don't fit in, or a reason for feeling depression, or a reason for having a difficult relationship with their body or with their family, and they're being given all of this as the one thing cures all. And of course it doesn't, and it can leave people with a lot more problems. And it's, I think this thing will pass, but that is the thing that concerns me the most, that it will pass, but there will be a lot of people who have been really badly hurt by it in the process.
Yes, the saddest sight from George Square that day was a young girl who was in the counter-protest. She ran up towards the crowd surrounding Kelly J. Keane, and she lifted up her shirt to reveal her mastectomy scars, and she was shouting in a very uncontrolled way, a very angry, rage-filled way. Over and over, she was shouting, "I'm happy, I'm happy," and I really felt for that girl, because she's got a very difficult life ahead of her, and until she finds her way out of the place she's in. And rather than surgery, you're seeing people who need someone to talk to, and it's a very sad sight to behold. And you're right, there will be many people harmed, and most of them will be people who are convinced by the narrative, convinced by the cult, and who go along with it, and who then find themselves having to deal with the consequences, the physical consequences, the emotional consequences of what they've done to themselves. And this will have a lot of problems with that for many years to come. Now, your campaign was hugely successful, and it had, although I don't think you were exactly calling for Nicola Sturgeon to resign as a major, or as the major plank of your campaign, it certainly became focused on the SNP, and particularly on Nicola Sturgeon, who is the SNP, or was at that point. And the pressure mounted on her and mounted, and very quickly she crumbled, and then she announced that she was resigning. This was a point of deep joy for many in Scotland who had seen the harm she'd done, and not just harm she'd done to women, but harm she'd done to the whole society, to the whole nation. So there was a lot of just happy people. I mean, she brought so much happiness to the country that day. She's never done anything like it. Could you describe how you reacted to all of those, to that victory, to her departure, and what happened around about that time to your campaign and your colleagues?
I don't think we can take all the credit, because I think there were other things going on with the SNP, and possibly a police visit or two might have been instrumental as well. But when we set out to do this, all we wanted was for political leaders, including Nicola Sturgeon, to sit down with us and explain what it was they thought they were doing. And we wanted to put forward why we thought they got some things wrong and how potentially we could mend it. That was all we wanted. And we wrote many, many times to Nicola Sturgeon. And she refused to meet us. We did have a meeting with Shirley Ann Somerville, And we did have an online meeting with Shona Robertson, but she always steadfastly refused, and she made her position very clear, I think, during the time of the rather infamous broom cupboard appeal. I don't know if you know what that was, but that was the occasion when some of the trans activists within the party had expressed horror and dismay about various things. I think it was around the time of the hate crime bill. And she took herself off to record a message to them, begging them not to leave the party, which she'd never done to any of the women who had been threatened or bullied or harassed by activists. So she nailed her colours very firmly to a mast. And I think at that point we knew that we weren't going to get anywhere. And that was obviously cemented when she then chose to say later on that our concerns were not valid. And for somebody who is so certain of her position, and this comes back to what I was saying about intellectual insecurity, she lacked the capacity or the intellectual ability to make that case to us. And she never even tried to. She never tried to with the women in her own party who she knew were opposed to this. And then she pretended to be surprised when, for example, Ash Reagan resigned. But Ash's concerns were very well known beyond the SNP. So the fact that the leader of the party did not know that either suggested she was completely out of touch, or that she was so arrogant and so intent on imposing her own will that she thought people wouldn't have the guts to stand by what they believed in. And she was proven wrong. But, you know, I think what happened and what was sort of horribly entertaining, and I say horribly because it was a horrible scenario, but was obviously the appearance of Isla Bryson. And nobody wants a double rapist to be necessary in order to make your case. But there was this hideous inevitability about that individual. And I think then a lot of people made manifest the reality of what happens when you are not allowed to challenge anybody's gender identity. And for me, the really key point in that was not just that this person was a double rapist, but that in the period since he was charged and convicted, he had been going to a college with a lot of young girls and helping them with spray tan when they were in their underwear. And people said afterwards, oh, well, if they should have known he'd been charged. But no, the fact is, you shouldn't have to know that somebody is a rapist or has been charged with rape to be able to say, I am not comfortable in this scenario. And I think that brought it home to a lot of people, because actually most people who commit sexual offences we don't know. So it was a perfect illustration of how terribly wrong self-ID can go. And I think that the waffling and the indecision that obviously she was she came out with when she was put under pressure to answer, is this a woman, was so revealing, because you cannot say everybody is valid and all that matters is somebody's personal identity unless it is that person. And only I, as your First Minister, have the ability to judge who is a valid person or who is not. And I think at that point, the sort of godlike edifice crumbled, because safeguards and law do not work on the basis that one person might be able to judge other individuals. And I think she was found out that intellectual inability to make the case at that point came through very clearly in a way that it probably hadn't up until then. So we were delighted. It was very exciting. It was a very exciting day when she went. largely because she had been such a driver of it. She was so determined. What became clear in the leadership campaign was that the party was pretty split between Humza Yousaf and the two female candidates, both of whom are opposed to GRR. So it was a nice little illustration that this is not something that most people in the country or within a political party are wedded to, but it is, I think, a mark of the weak current leadership that they've decided that they have to maintain this, almost because it's Sturgeon's legacy. But it's, as you say, it was part of the legacy that destroyed her. So it's a little bit like if Margaret Thatcher had gone and the Conservative Party had decided to hang on to the poll tax. It's just stupid.
Yes. On the subject of just stupid, for about a week we had 3 genders in Scotland. We had male, female and rapist, because when the press were asking government ministers, is Isla Bryson a man or a woman? You had Nicola Sturgeon and others saying, well, I know this. They're a rapist. Can't even say he or she. Isla Bryson's a rapist. Okay, so that was, we had 3 genders for a little while, just for a week, as the narrative collapsed. And I mean, one of my criticisms of Nicola Sturgeon for many years is her intellectual inability to think through any new problems. I think she's a follower, not a leader. And she'd followed this gender ideology. She'd learned her line, she'd followed it faithfully, and she hadn't the intellect to test it, to think it through. And it was somewhat of a surprise that was the issue, that finally revealed the result of having someone without intellectual ability in a leadership position. But that's what it was. And yes, there was a lot of happy people. I couldn't actually find the words on UK Column. I showed a clip of Northern Ireland football fans singing Sweet Caroline, because it's the most joyful thing I could find on the internet that particular day, and that kind of summed up how I felt. It was just so good that particular hurdle, that particular evil leadership had gone. And we knew we were going to get Humza and it was going to be somewhat more of the same, but to have that victory has changed things, in that we'll never get to the point again where the view that a woman is an adult human female, it can be painted any longer as hate speech. I think that one's been defeated. I hope once and for all. So this brings us to, I think, the present day. So where is your campaign at? What challenges are you facing right now? And where do you see it going next?
So the first thing that's going to be happening very soon is the Scottish Government's challenge on the Section 35. Because as I'm sure everybody will know, but just to set it out briefly, the GRR bill was passed at the end of last year, and the UK government decided to intervene with an unprecedented Section 35 because they said that this bill would impact on equality legislation, which is reserved. And there's no question that it will. They were told that it would by the EHRC. They've affected surprised by this, but actually they were warned lots of times that there were UK-wide implications of having a different system north and south of the border of Scotland and England. So this was blocked. The Scottish Government are now going to court to try to get this lifted. They are simultaneously, however, fighting us on an appeal over gender representation on public boards. We won a judicial review a while back over their definition of women in the Gender Representation on Public Boards Act, which they had put in as basically self-ID. And that was struck out. The highest court of Scotland said that measures to help women, by definition, excluded people who are biologically male. The Scottish Government then came back with revised guidelines, but they put back in people who had a GRC. Now, this is slightly technical, but the Scottish Government's argument has been that getting a GRC changes nothing. So therefore, extending the GRR doesn't really change very much. It just allows you to change your birth certificate, and they were framing it as being able to get married or die as your true gender. But they were saying it didn't grant you any additional rights. But then they'd argued in this case, this recent JR, that we brought another JR, they'd argued that getting a GRC, a gender recognition certificate, to change your legal sex allowed you to take advantages of measures designed for the opposite sex. But only if you had a GRC. And if you didn't have a GRC, you couldn't take advantage of those measures. So they were effectively arguing that having a GRC changed somebody's legal status. And this, of course, then fed into the arguments for the UK government as to why extending the pool of people eligible for a GRC would cause problems for UK-wide equality law. So they have two cases, and they have to make actually diametrically opposed arguments in both of them, which will be very entertaining. Now, we think there are issues around equality legislation, even if we are right about the rights conferred by a GRC. There are issues anyway. But the fact is that when we brought the JR about the what a GRC does, we knew it was a little bit heads we win, tails you lose for the Scottish Government, because we knew that whatever the outcome of that case, it would affect what they were saying about the gender recognition bill. So they're slightly stuck. And the first case, the one against the UK government, is September, and then ours is October. And so we will just have to see where that goes. I imagine that it's the first stage for the UK government. I imagine if they lose, or whoever loses, it will go all the way. It will keep going to appeal. So although an election could get in the way of that. We are going to keep the pressure on politically as well. We have lots of conversations, I think, to have now with other political parties as well. Obviously, UK Labour has moved positions recently, which is great. So there are lots of groups throughout the UK who are interested in talking to them. We're obviously especially interested to have the conversation in Scotland. And we will continue to keep having these conversations and to keep trying to ensure that policy and practice reflect the law, because a lot of the issue as well has been that the law actually isn't that. There are some issues in law that need to be teased out and clarified, but many of the issues have come from policy getting ahead of the law. So there are areas within schools, within hospitals, within universities, where people are pretty much campaigning to have things set back to where they should be. And those are the things that we are continuing to work on, that we hear from people every day about workplace scenarios, and just trying to ensure that there is the correct education out there, because for a very long time, lobby groups have been misrepresenting the law, and they have been getting these policies into places like schools where it really shouldn't be. So there's a lot of work to do to reverse all that.
It's been very striking in Scotland that policy is, for all practical purposes, law for the public sector. And this is essentially due to the control that employment gives to the Scottish Government over the very large part of the population that works for it, and who are, in most cases, very afraid of it, of the disciplinary process, of the potential for sacking on, if you're in a profession like teaching, which is almost all state-run, of maybe never working in your chosen profession again, that comes from disobeying policy. And this has resulted in policy being treated by the public sector as tantamount to law, as essentially interchangeable with law, to the point where I often wonder whether they actually appreciate there's a difference at all. We saw this very much in the No to Name Person campaign, another successful campaign that significantly hold the SNP below the waterline, and that when they could no longer get anything through in terms of legislation, it became a creature entirely of policy, and it then morphed into many different things, and many different smaller fights had to be won thereafter. So the idea that policy is law for all practical purposes in Scotland is, I think correct, and something that very much needs to be fought back against. So I wish you all success in that. Just in closing now, would you like to sum up, or have any closing words, or just sum up how you view this fight from where you stand now, and say any final words to our audience on its importance?
Well, I think that in any society, if you do not value 51% of the population, and you hold that their rights are somehow disposable, or that their safety is negligible, then something is going wrong. And we need to be able to have proper conversations about what that means. And we need to be able to have proper conversations about policy and about law, without reverting all the time to name calling, to simplistic slogans. And we need to get out of echo chambers and bubbles. And we need to stop being frightened to educate people. We need to be able to have conversations, and people need to be prepared to be challenged. I worry about people who feel that their view is the correct one, and everybody else is either with them or against them. And there's been rather too much of that generally. So I think, that there's been a failure, and it comes back to an intellectual failure. There's been an intellectual failure on all levels of society, and we need to start to think about how we can cope with that, and how we can have the proper conversations. But I would also say that, we're going to keep going, and we're always happy to hear from people who have anything to add, or anything to say, or any help that they can give. It's been longer than I thought it would be, and I think we're still going to be keeping going for a while longer. And we will go on as long as needful, but it's good to know that there's the support out there.
Susan Smith of For Women Scotland, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you. We'll continue to follow your campaigning and your work, and we wish you every success in that. Until next time, thank you very much for talking to us.